Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. I had mentioned that I was going to start doing YouTube live streams again, so several of them are booked. You can check the schedule on themasculinist.com if you're interested, and just listen for them in the podcast feed. I'm going to have one this week, and you'll be able to hear my conversation with John Moody probably on Thursday. So look forward to that in the podcast feed. I also plan to keep talking a little bit about elites. I have a couple ideas for a podcast coming up. One is I want to look at elite selection through the lens of how the Mormon Church selects their elites and how that helps explain why they are so successful as a religious organization at a time when religion is kind of in decline. And then I also maybe want to talk about, do a podcast on whether you and I personally are ready to step up and be elites, if that's what the situation calls for. Today, though, I have a podcast topic that's a little time sensitive. Well, it's not really time sensitive, but you might call it timely. So I want to strike while the iron's hot on that. But before I get into that topic, I want to call your attention to an article I just put up at American Reformer, and I'll stick a link to this in the show notes. And it's basically about how evangelicals are second-class citizens in American conservatism. So evangelicals vote overwhelmingly for the Republican Party, and yet they have essentially been frozen out of institutional leadership in Conservatism, Inc., and fundamentally aren't getting their concerns addressed all that much. And so maybe you ought to rethink that. So I talked a lot about the history and some quotes you may have never seen before in there. So be sure to check that out. I think it's a very important piece to understand that essentially how conservatism was a fundamentally Catholic project from its beginning. And someone else wrote an article this week talking about the Catholic intellectual ecosystem, and now that helps explain why so many, kind of Catholic pundits are so prominent in our world. And, I'm not going to dispute that there may be better, high-level Catholic intellectual theologians or something in the Protestant church. That's kind of beyond my pay grade. Definitely a lot of smart Catholics out there, and we know the evangelicals really have not executed intellectually to the level that they should have. But the reason that so many Catholics, like, say, Sohrab Ahmari, which is one of the people that, he mentions in there, have such a high profile is because Catholics essentially own and control Conservatism, Inc., at the end of the day. And, they founded it, right? William F. Buckley was a Catholic. Protestants were always underrepresented, and evangelicals came in late to the movement and has always been particularly underrepresented and, quite candidly, not really liked in private by some of the people at the top. So you can check out that. It's really important. Sunday, October 31st, was Reformation Sunday, and it was also All Saints Day. So technically, I think All Saints Day is November 1st, but it's celebrated in churches on October 31st, and I think some churches celebrated it on, this past Sunday, so a week later. And, I grew up in churches that didn't talk about any of this stuff. I mean, I probably could have guessed what Reformation Day was. Well, Aaron, what's Reformation Day? Well, probably has something to do with Martin Luther and his theses. But if you said, what's All Saints Day, I probably would have said, that's a Catholic thing, right? And it is a Catholic thing, by the way. The Catholic Church does celebrate All Saints Day. And if you want to see all the permutations and combinations of how all the different denominations do or don't think about All Saints Day, you can go to Wikipedia and look at that. But many Protestant denominations do also celebrate All Saints Day. And, the service was very nice at my church for those this year. So first off, we started off singing A Mighty Fortress Is Our God. That was the opening hymn by Martin Luther. It's a great song. I love the hymn, A Mighty Fortress Is Our God. And that's a hymn that I really did not know growing up. I didn't even know it existed until within the last 15 years. I don't think I attended a church that sang hymns until like 2012 or something. And so, I just never knew it. And maybe you don't know it. So I don't want to assume everybody knows the song. So I'm going to throw a link to A Mighty Fortress Is Our God in the show notes. And if you have not heard this, you should hear it because it's very important. And then later in the service, they did the necrology, which is the list of the dead. And it's basically the members of the church who died in the previous year. And it did a little video montage, sort of like at the Academy Awards, how they show all the members of the Academy who'd passed away. It was very nice. Then the pastor preached a sermon on Hebrews 11. And then our final closing hymn was For All the Saints, which is another great hymn It's another one, much like Mighty Fortresses of God. I didn't know that one. And so maybe you don't know it either. So I will throw a link to For All the Saints into the show notes. It's a, again, traditional All Saints Day hymn because it refers to the people who have, died and proceeded on to their eternal reward. I think it's something like, for all the saints who from their labors rest, who thee by faith before the world confessed. So it's really good. It's also commonly used at funerals. When I was YouTube searching for a recording of this, I think the number 2 hit that came up was George H.W. Bush's funeral, his state funeral, where For All the Saints was the recessional hymn as they carried his casket out of National Cathedral. So if you don't like the version that I put in the show notes, you could go look at that. It's a good glimpse at what a state funeral looks like in the United States as well. It's got a beautiful musical setting by Rafe Vaughan Williams. And again, I just also wanted to put that, since I'm on this thing, give you a little tidbit here. You'll often see reference to a composer whose name appears to be Ralph Vaughan Williams, but his name is actually pronounced Rafe for some strange reason. I don't know why he went that way. And there's no shame in actually pronouncing a name wrong or pronouncing words wrong. I mean, I pronounce words wrong all the time. I'm known to say synod instead of synod. Last week's podcast, I think I made reference to this guy who I pronounced his name Robert Michaels. That's probably not how you pronounce it. And so, there's a billion names out there. We don't necessarily know how they all, but, again, if we're in a setting and then it comes up and we say it wrong, we kind of feel like an idiot, right? It's just kind of a natural human reaction. So I'll give you a freebie on that one. It's pronounced Rafe Vaughan Williams. So take a look at that and for the future reference. But it's a great hymn. Be sure to listen to it. And again, I didn't know what any of this stuff was when I was growing up. I was completely disconnected from the hymns and completely disconnected from the history of the church. And I think that's pretty common among evangelicals. Those of you who are Catholics or Orthodox or Lutheran, you're probably laughing right now as I'm saying all this stuff because, you're much more connected to the history, through the liturgy, through all this stuff, of course. And, but there's just a lot of Protestant churches today that play almost exclusively contemporary music and never play the hymns. And so it's possible for someone to grow up and attend church, for not just their whole childhood, but even into adulthood, and really never hear very many hymns. And these are a really important part of, our Anglo-American Protestant patrimony. In fact, I'd say they're a big part of our just plain American patrimony, as a people here. Now, obviously, if you live in another country, I know I have listeners I get a lot of listeners for Finland for some reason. I'm sure in Finland you've got your own traditional music, your own things there, and all these other countries. This is my country, so this is the ones that I know and that I've learned, and so they're just such a key part of that. And our cultural patrimony in America is really under assault today, right? All we hear is denigrations of the American past, of the American project, particularly if you are the dreaded white evangelical. But it wasn't the public school systems or the New York Times that made churches stop singing hymns, right? We did that to ourselves. And so we disconnected people from an important part of their cultural patrimony. A lot of, so, excuse me, I got a little bit of a cold here, so I'm working on that. And, the hymns, they're not just part of our cultural patrimony. A lot of them are just truly incredible pieces of music. I mean, they really are. They're beautiful. And, so I think there's something that we should preserve. Now, a lot of these call them paleo-reformed people, maybe that's a term you could use, love to do psalm singing. That's like a big thing they're pushing. We need to sing the psalms. Now, of course, a lot of hymns are psalm settings, right? And there is in the Reformed tradition, a history of psalm singing. If you really want to go full in on that, there's a microscopic denomination. It's an old denomination still around today called the Reformed Presbyterian Church in North America. And the RPCNA does exclusively a cappella psalmody, which might help explain why they're a microscopic denomination today. But if that's your thing, you can do that. I'm not going to tell people that you shouldn't focus on psalm singing, but the hymns, in an American context, are much more of a living tradition, right? Many churches today still actually sing psalms, right? You can go to a lot of churches this Sunday, thousands of them across the nation, you're going to hear a lot of hymns. So this is a living tradition, It's not a practice that has, was niche or we're trying to, resurrect from something like that. This is a living tradition that can and should be carried on. And, one of the themes I'm going to keep coming back to in the podcast is this idea of patrimony preservation, or thinking about how to preserve our cultural patrimony. When I lived in Chicago, a lot of my friends in Chicago who grew up there, who had been like Serbian or Polish or second or third generation, when they were kids, every Saturday, their parents made them go to class to study the language, to study Polish, to study Serbian. Now, they were never achieved fluency in it. But the idea was that these communities understood that if we don't consciously inculcate our language and our culture into the next generation, it is going to be completely lost, right, and homogenized away in, kind of the American project. Now, of course, none of these people are actually Polish, right? In the sense, right? It's just like the Greeks, right, in America. Now, yes, they're Greeks. There's a Greek culture in America, but it's an American Greek culture. It's an Americanized Greek culture, but nevertheless, it still is an actual culture, a subculture that exists here, a people that, think of themselves as possessing a unique ethnic status within the larger American project. As we move into the negative world, as there's the rise of the nuns, many, many, many people who just don't have any religious faith, and you've got all of these, more hostility towards Christianity, that society at large, the culture at large, is no longer going to support or pass on, patrimony like the hymns. What are we going to see? We're going to see that we are going to have to be much more intentional and conscious about passing on our cultural patrimony. Part of being reduced to a minority is that we have to start thinking like a minority, right? It's minority mindset. We got to start having a minority mindset. That's a big shift. That's a difficult shift, but it's one that needs to happen. So I think, again, hymns, big part of the cultural patrimony. We should think about that and how we pass those on and make sure that, our kids actually know the hymns. The second thing I'm just thinking about is like how ahistorical kind of the evangelical church is in America. And again, I attended a rural kind of fundamentalist, Assemblies of God church, man. I knew the Bible cold. Right, growing up. That's one thing I'm just so thankful for to come out of that is, man, you learn the Bible in the Bible Belt. Probably a lot of these, kind of rural Baptist churches too. You learn the Bible, right? So I knew a ton about the Bible. I probably couldn't have told you what the Nicene Creed was. Right? I probably couldn't have told you. And, even, later you attend, like I was in Chicago, attending a non-denominational megachurch, like, Baptist basically. And, we don't sing hymns and, we don't talk kind of about history. It's we just grew up in a totally disconnected way. And, and that's why I so appreciated the sermon that my pastor preached on the 31st. It was just an excellent way, whole architecture of the liturgy and the sermon tied together all of this stuff in a very powerful way. So he preached on Hebrews 11, and he talked about, look, there's this great cloud of witnesses, these Old Testament saints, if you will, who had been faithful to God. The book of Hebrews is basically a book essentially warning people against the dangers of apostasy and letting go of their faith. It's not totally clear, but it sounds to me like the church might be getting a little persecution. There might be a little trouble coming their way. So look, you got to hold on to your faith. Do not lose your confidence, which has a great reward. And one of the things they do is, Hebrews 11, they're going through all the people who previously, were faithful in their faith. And so it's like, this is the cloud of witnesses that we're surrounded with. Of course, it's a great piece. A lot of people preach that. And, he preaches that. And then he also, ties it to the early church and that community and says, okay, great. Let's talk about the reformers. Let's talk about Luther and Calvin and John Knox and people like that. And of course, actually we sing, A Mighty Fortress is Our God, written by Martin Luther. And then we talk about, hey, it comes forward to the present day. And he talked about the faithfulness of his own family and his great-great-grandfather, who had been a minister in Tennessee. And he talked about the generations that had gone before faithfully, in our own congregation. And, again, I had never been in a church that actually celebrated All Saints' Day. It's like the first first church I've attended that did. And I'm like, wow, it was pretty powerful. And he essentially brought together the fact that, hey, you have a legacy, right? You have a patrimony. You have an inheritance that comes to you from all of these people who have come before you and are why you are here, right? Because, we can think about that in terms of, it's the legacy of the church. Yes. If you're Protestant, right, it's the legacy of the Protestant Reformation. It could be the legacy of the particular church that you attend. It could be, the legacy of your nation. It could be the legacy of your family. But we have inherited all of this that brought us where we are. Because if you don't know where you came from, then you do not understand the value of your patrimony, and you may not even understand that you have received an inheritance, much less the value of it. And I think about this in terms of, for example, the blasé decision that people make to say, I'm just not going to have kids, don't want to save the environment, or I just, don't want to cramp my style with kids. Think about what happened to enable you to be alive today. Think about generation after generation after generation extending back, right, to Adam and Eve, the dawn of man, of people who had kids, who sacrificed, who nurtured them, who raised them, who fed them, who trained them, who survived famines and plagues and wars and pestilence, or people like my ancestors who set out on these kind of desperate exodus from Sicily or the Saarland to come to America to try to find another life. Just think about all the sacrifice, all the faithfulness, everything that went into creating an unbroken, continuous human chain of people to get to you and me. And they were like, you know what? I just don't want to have any kids. I mean, it's like, think about the sacrifice that went into enabling you to even exist, and we don't even value it. We don't even understand it, right? We don't even think about it that way. Or even just think about, for example, the grace of God that you have personally received. Have you just thought about that? I mean, I think about that a lot. I say, man, why did God choose me? I see so many people out there who are objectively better people than me. And, yet I received, not just that I became a Christian, but I received blessings that they did not. And I see sometimes areas where they're kind of walking in ignorance, and it's keeping them from getting the things that they want out of life. And I realized I was walking in that same ignorance, but somehow, God intervened in my life and revealed to me that, hey, everything you think on this topic is completely wrong, by the way. You need to wow, why me? Why would God pick me? And there is, because I'm certainly among the undeserving. And I think about that a lot. I say, it goes to show you the awesomeness of God's grace, right? And there is a certain, divine election element that God, has mercy on whom he'll have mercy, as it says. Well, there's also a generational element to it, I think, because in God's economy, our actions have generational consequences. Go back to the Old Testament. Think about David, for example. His first child with Bathsheba died because of his sin. That's the sort of thing we don't like to think about, right? But his child with Bathsheba, first child, died on account of his sin. But we also see that later his son Solomon is the king, and he's taken all these foreign wives, and, he's, which he wasn't supposed to do, and he's even built altars to their God. And, God says, I'm going to judge you. I am going to take the kingdom away from you and your lineage. But he says, for the sake of my servant David, I will not do it during your lifetime, and I will leave one tribe for your sons to rule over. And later we can fast forward. Jehoram is the king in Judah, and Jehoram was an evil king. I think the Bible says that he walked in the paths of Ahab, the king of Israel, who's this kind of notoriously evil king. And God says what? For the sake of my servant David and my promises to him, I will not destroy Judah. For the sake of my servant David. And then fast forward to Hezekiah. This is probably 200-300 years later. There's this massive Assyrian army coming to assault Jerusalem. Hezekiah, takes these demand letter to the temple. It's a great story. And God says what? For the sake of myself and my servant David, I will not allow this army to destroy this. So hundreds, 200-300 years later, God is still saying, for the sake of my servant David, the man after my God's own heart, I will have mercy on the kingdom of Judah. And we actually see this, we'll see, for the sake of Abraham, for the sake of Jacob. It's just like a line that recurs over and over in the Old Testament. When I heard a guy preach a sermon on this one time, I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And, you might say, well, Aaron, what you got to understand, he's talking about messianic promises. This isn't, generous. Well, if you want to believe that, that's fine. I'm not trying to get into a theological debate here. I'm just pointing that out. What I would say is if you go to, the Ten Commandments, what does God say? He says, I, the Lord your God, right, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the father upon the sons, even into the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, right, but abounding in loving kindness to thousands of generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. And so there's generational consequences in God's economy to what we're doing. And so I think about, for example, okay, why do I risk? Maybe God just decided to have mercy on me. But we also see, right, my mom, right, she prays for me every day, right? She's a faithful person. I also think about my grandparents. My grandparents prayed for me every single day of my life until they died. And, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, he basically attended Mass every single day for almost his entire life. Only until he got very old did he stop attending Mass every day. And you think about that, the faithfulness of these people did that. Does their faithfulness, right? Does God have mercy on us, right? Because of the faithfulness of our ancestors. And I think to some extent he does. And it doesn't have to be necessarily in a supernatural sense, right? That inheritance of faith passed from, grandparent to parent to child, that's part of God's grace. But our grace has generational consequences. And, we don't like to think about that. We don't like to think about that. And, I think about it, but, we should. We should think about it, because one of the things I just think about, wow, imagine that my actions, that my faithfulness in this life could rebound to the benefit of my descendants for thousands of generations into the future. Now, I don't think thousands is intended as a literal number. It's probably a symbolic number there. But this idea that our faithfulness can propagate generationally, to our children, to our grandchildren, to others in our lives, it's a powerful thing. A few months ago, somebody tweeted something. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was something to the effect of, all of the churches that Paul started are extinct, but the Church of Jesus Christ is still alive. Amen. The impression I got there was kind of a little bit of a smugness of him saying that, all of the churches that, Paul had planted had gone under. But there was just one problem. This tweet kind of went viral because that's not actually true. So people started tweeting him a picture like, oh, here is a picture of the current bishop of Thessaloniki. Here's the bishop of this church. Here's the bishop of that church. He's like, oh, yeah, actually, some of these churches are. So I do think some of the churches that Paul started are out of business today. I think the Church of Ephesus is gone, but some of the churches that we read about in the New Testament are still here today. So think about the church at Thessalonica. You can open your Bible and go to the book of Acts, and you can read about that church and its tumultuous founding over the course of about 6 weeks. It's a great story. Then you can read Paul's letters, right? He wrote to that church. Then you can get on a plane and you can go there and you can visit it today. And you can talk to the bishop who is the head of that church today, a church that Paul started. And think about that, right? We like to talk about, well, the church is the oldest institution in Western society or in the world or something like that. But I think we've had this idea that it's just, this nebulous, the church, right? The Christian religion in some global sense has been around for a long time, but there are actual particular churches that have been in existence for 2,000 years, right? 2,000 years. And do you think that the Metropolitan of Thessaloniki is not, really aware on a daily basis of that fact and understands the precious legacy, right, with which he has been entrusted? That he understands that he has received this inheritance, that it is his responsibility to steward and pass on to the next generation for another 2,000 years, maybe. And we think about that. And I think about that, my grandparents, or think about that. We've inherited this great legacy, and that comes with an incredible weight of obligation on us. And it is not just obligation, but there's a certain magnificence that comes, from thinking about what we have had. And, patrimony is power. When you think about it, patrimony is power. My old pastor used to love using the film The Lion King as a sermon illustration. Now, it's been a long time since I've seen The Lion King, so maybe I'll get some of this stuff wrong. But basically, there's this lion cub named Simba, who's the child of the king, and his uncle basically wants to be the king, and so he hatches this plot to kill the king and kill Simba so he can take over. And this plot basically succeeds, and the king is killed. Simba manages to escape, but his uncle makes him think that he is the one who's responsible for his father's dying. And so he runs away. He isn't killed, and he kind of escapes into another part, of the of the jungle or the savannah or whatever. The uncle takes over. He brings in the hyenas and he oppresses the land. And so Simba grows up as this sort of happy-go-lucky, carefree, free agent. He's just enjoying life, right? He's the king of the jungle and he's just having fun. And eventually, some female lion from his old land comes back and says, oh, Simba, look at what's happening back home. You need to come back and deal with it. I'm not dealing with that, right? That's not my problem. So anyhow, he runs into his father's old shaman, Rafiki, who tells him, you don't even know who you are. And then he has this mystical encounter with his father where he realizes, hey, wait a minute. I am my father's son. I am the rightful king of the lions. And that means I have to go back. It's a great scene, and I'll actually put a link to it. I did watch that scene just to make sure I got it right. So I'll put a link to that scene in the show notes. And he has to go back, and he has to, kick out his uncle and take over and become the king again over the kingdom of the lions. And here's the king. He restores the righteous order and the flourishing of the land. He brings back shalom to the land. And of course, my pastor used to use this illustration, as an analogy, Simba as not knowing who he was as the child of a king, to us as not knowing in our hearts that we really are sons of God, that we've been adopted. We've been given that spirit of adoption. But we can think about that and not understanding, right, our legacy as well. Once Simba knew who he was, once you know who you are, once you know where you come from, once you know what your patrimony is, that is powerful in ways that we don't fully appreciate. And, there's a reason society does not want you thinking about this stuff, right? There is a reason that they want you grilling brats in your backyard and watching NFL on the flat screen and scrolling through the Instagram on your phone. And there's nothing wrong with doing this if I do some of that stuff, right? I grill brats at least. But, they want you living like Simba before he figured out who he was, just enjoying life, consuming, being a cog in the wheel, no threat to them, no threat to the injustices of this world, no danger that you might try to restore the righteous order in the land. They don't want you thinking about that stuff. And so when I see these evangelical leaders today essentially disparaging their own cultural patrimony, their own inheritance. Oh, I'm so glad we've got beyond Bible Belt Christianity. Aren't we so glad we don't have cultural Christianity anymore? Like what? It's like they're disparaging their own, their own legacy, their own patrimony. It's this idea, if I could only free myself from the shackles, right, of the past, of all this encumbrance of this inheritance that I have, then I'm free, to be this authentic self, to be this Christian self. Isn't that basically like secular thinking, right? And people who think that way are absolutely no threat to the spiritual forces of wickedness or to the powers that be that are perpetrating injustices in our land. It's just not going to happen that way. And, that's also that mentality, right? That's why we don't care when the 125-year-old church down the street, which is down to a handful of old people, just kind of dies. Because, why would we encumber ourselves with all the burdens and the difficulties of trying to sustain that church when we could just start a new church? Why don't we just start a new church, man? And then it's going to be perfectly contextualized to the moment. It'll be, we won't sing any hymns. Everything will be, bespoke, hip, cool music or whatever like that. And, we do that. And of course, then again, that church, when your church plant will probably fail, right? Chances are it's going to fail. And even if it succeeds, probably it's not going to last much more than a generation because we're not sustaining anything, right? We don't even think in terms of legacy mindset in such important ways. And so I think, we need a new mentality, right? We need to be anchoring ourselves in the thousands of years, right, of history of God's people, right? That great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us does not just include the people who are listed in Hebrews 11, right? It includes people who lived 20 years ago, who lived 50 years ago, who lived 150 years ago, right? People in your own family, in your own country who served faithfully, not perfectly, but served faithfully, right? And made it possible, right, for you to inherit what you have inherited and you don't even know it. And so I think in our world, this has to be consciously inculcated. We have to consciously ensure that people understand the magnitude, right, of the patrimony that we have inherited and what that means. And this is especially hard for Americans, right, because we are a deracinated people, right? So racine is root, racinated is uprooted. We were all uprooted from wherever we were before and came here. And some people have no idea where they came from. Most famously slaves, the people who were brought over as slaves don't know where they came from. If you remember back to the 70s, they made a mini-series out of Alex Haley's book, Roots, that just so incredibly resonated with a lot of people because they felt keenly the way that their past, that their heritage, that their roots had been taken away from them. And obviously that's the most extreme case that we have, but we also have a lot of people just flat out don't even know. And so, and we're more individualistic, we're more mobile, we're more dynamic. We're never going to go back to some you stay in your village for thousands of years people. And that is authentically part of our patrimony and heritage as Americans. We have to be authentic to that. But I think we need to do much more to inculcate, knowledge of our patrimony and what we have inherited. Partially it's powerful, partially then, man, we have an obligation. That comes with responsibilities, right? And I got 3 concrete ideas. It's not going to solve this gigantic world peace problem I laid out here, but I got 3 concrete, tangible things that you can do to start doing that right now. Number 1, sing the hymns, right? Teach them to your children. Make sure that your children and you know many of the great Anglo-American hymns. If you're a pastor, maybe you should be playing hymns in your church. It doesn't mean you have to be exclusively hymns. It doesn't mean that they have to all be to very traditional organ accompaniment or that you have to have a choir with robes. Okay, I'm not saying that you have to do that. The church I attended in 2012 that started singing hymns, they had a contemporary band. It also played some hymns. Make sure that great cultural inheritance is something that you take up and make sure that your kids take up. Celebrate All Saints Day in your church. It's not just a Catholic thing. I think, a lot of these churches are younger, newer, and so they haven't had a lot of people die. But I noticed in the last year with COVID, a lot of churches had people die that maybe didn't normally have people die in their church. And so honoring the members of your church who have passed away in the previous year, I think there's something there. Honoring those who have gone before to their eternal rewards there. And you know what? It's a good opportunity to sing for all the saints in sort of a liturgically appropriate context. And you could, if you're Protestant, third, you can celebrate Reformation Day, right? You can at least sing A Mighty Fortress Is Our God and, make a mention of, blah, 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 right? And this is the anniversary of when Martin Luther nailed his theses to that, door of that church. So it's just something some things to consider. I like to give practical, I talk about a lot of big, grandiose kind of things, but I also want to talk about some practical things. Those are some very specific practical tips. And of course, for many people just totally disconnected from the history of the church, I think that's something that we have to reconnect with, right? None of us, this is important to keep right, not one of us would be here as Christians today if there had not been a 2,000-year unbroken chain of faithful people who sustained the church generation after generation after generation, right? So that we had a place, right? Something for God to save us into. And so, wow, we should think about that. We should be cognizant about that. We have a patrimony. We have a legacy. And you can think about that, and I will talk to you again next.